masculinity is constructed almost in relation to things like how big your penis is, how many women you've had. It's so damaging. And then femininity, on the other hand, is like constructed in accordance to stuff like virginity, purity, innocence. We should allow for people to make their own choices. If I masturbate, will XYZ negative outcome happen? Whether it's acne, hair fall, muscle loss, memory loss, blindness, will hair grow on my palms? Will I go to hell? Who are you really? Why do we need to talk about sex? You only think about sex. People seem to require reassurance that they're perfectly normal. Bodies, desires, etc., are in fact normal.
Sex, intimacy, and all those emotions and anxiety associated with it are a part of all our lives. But we don't talk about it enough, right? And when we do talk about it, we often trivialize it or turn around and not take it that seriously or as something that has to be whispered and spoken. But there are people and creators and educators who are making it almost their mission in life to really make people understand not just the role of sex and intimacy in their lives, but really to understand themselves through it. One such person is Leeza Mangaldas, and she's my guest on this episode of Take a Pause with me, Varun Duggi. And before I get into that chat, I want to make sure you hit that bell icon and smash subscribe. And I'm going to get into my chat with Leeza Mangaldas. Hey, Lisa, welcome to the show. I must be honest, and I said this to you right before we started recording, is that talking about intimacy, talking about sex is something which I've always been reasonably awkward about. I've used the tool of using humor around it as a way to kind of bypass talking about it. And I want to kind of start off with that. I want to start off by asking you, saying, why do we look at talking about intimacy and sex, but intimacy at a larger sense, as something that is like we have to walk on eggshells around, that we kind of figure out? I thought that's a great place to kind of start, and then we'll deep dive from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately most of us inherit shame around sex, right? It's very hard not to. I mean, it's just such a sort of relentless and omnipresent part of the fabric via which we are fed any information about sex. Like from a very young age, it's made out to be that sex and the body parts associated with sex and sexuality, all of that is shameful, not just private, but shameful. And so, I mean, awkward is actually like one of the lesser emotion. How should I say it? It's awkwardness we can still overcome, right? Whereas I think that, that deep sense of shame associated with sex and guilt associated with sex can sort of impact our relationship, our sense of self, our own ability to be forthright about our sexuality or to claim our bodily autonomy. I mean, women's sexuality, for example, is perhaps even more laden with that sense of stigma and shame, as if it's not something that you're allowed to be curious about or want to explore. I mean, good girls aren't supposed to like sex, right? It's also so heteronormative, what we learn, that if you perhaps find that your own desires or curiosities or arousal doesn't fit that heteronormative template, then again, there's, an added layer of stigma attached. So it's unfortunate that often, even if we haven't formulated ideas ourselves yet, we're coming into our sort of adult sexual landscape with this baggage, So of course, I mean, most people find it awkward, and I've found it awkward. It's not like I was just born like with this openness about sex. It's been a journey, of learning and unlearning and self-awareness and sort of like, and study even. I mean, I've made it my business to really study this stuff.
Yeah. So how did that journey begin? I think that I've always been curious. I think as people who focus on certain areas and people who not just create content but really have made it a part of who they are and who they project out and kind of teach the world and rather educate the world about, there is always an inflection point, always a point when it starts off from. So how did that start for you?
So I've always had an interest in sexuality as a theme. I mean, even in college, I studied literature and art with a focus on gender and sexuality at Columbia, where I was an undergrad. And in many ways, I feel so lucky that my first sexual experiences and my own sort of like coming of age took place in this very liberal environment. I mean, it's such a left-leaning college. It's in New York City, one of the most diverse and open places in the world. And that is not to say that the West is better or anything. I think this particular campus in this particular city is very unique, even within the context of America. I mean, look at what is happening in America right now around abortion, for example. So most of the world continues to be very sex negative, very heteronormative, very misogynistic, very homophobic. It's a problem globally, not unique to India. But I do feel lucky that in that particular environment, I felt extremely safe and extremely not judged. How should I say? That was inarticulate, but do you get what I mean? As a young woman, I felt like I could explore and experience, whatever I wanted to in a very safe and gender equal environment. And I feel grateful for that, and I was also an RA in college, a resident advisor. So you're in charge of the residents, the other students living on your floor. They typically are at least 1 year junior to you. You can only be an RA your second year onwards. And so you're also given certain training, like we would do peer-led consent workshops. I would have a bag of condoms on my door so that students could have access to free protection very easily right where they live. Health services was right in the same building as my freshman year dorm. So if you did want to explore contraception beyond condoms, such as a pill or an IUD or something, you could consult with a gynecologist right there. I was so grateful to have such easy access to measures that would allow for me to navigate things like consent and contraception or other aspects of just, practical stuff to mitigate the risks that come with having sex, without having to go through 10 things and be shamed and have to, involve like 10 other people. And then when I came back to Bombay after graduating, because you're like 17 or 18 or whatever, I was 18 when I was in college, you're only having your first little few adult experiences. And then really adult life begins I was still figuring stuff out, right? I can't say I knew everything. But I found it to be so much harder then when I came here to navigate this stuff. Like just going to a gynecologist can be such a process. How do you find the right one without letting 10 other people know and then tell the gynecologist you're not married? Suddenly you're judged by them. It's like such a process. Even to just walk into a pharmacy and ask for condoms as a woman is not a comfortable experience in India. And in many other parts of the world too, actually, for that matter. I also found that I myself, it was such a realization for me through my 20s or whatever, figuring out my own body. Like the information we're given about what sex should look like is so penetration centric, right? It's like erection, penetration, ejaculation. Nobody mentions how women's pleasure works. And so many women think that, our pleasure is just complicated, it's difficult. This is the kind of messaging even you see in women's magazines or various other mainstream formats via which any sort of communications around sex are presented over the several last decades. There's always been this messaging that women take longer, women's bodies are complicated, women's orgasms are mysterious and elusive. But actually, we've never centered women's pleasure in the sexual scripts we're fed. Penetration might not be the most reliable route to orgasm for most women. It doesn't mean that their orgasms are difficult. Nobody knows where the clitoris is or what it is. Or, once you have that knowledge, suddenly it's not so complicated at all.
World changing.
Or foreplay. Foreplay, it's spoken as if it's this optional thing, right? All of these other acts, whether it's kissing or cuddling or oral sex or whatever it is, these are all optional precursors to the main event. Sex is penetration. But actually, all of this other stuff can also be extremely pleasurable, and why not? Why can't oral sex be the main event? Who says it can't be? So I feel like as soon as we expand our views on what sex is, it can be more pleasurable for all parties. So it came from a place of like, I wish I'd known this stuff earlier. I wish it wasn't so hard. I wish it didn't take me to like 20, till I was in my late 20s to figure out that my own body and pleasure isn't so mysterious. And there's nothing wrong or broken or complicated about it. We just never knew that these other things may be more effective for vulva owners than penetration, which is like the most how should I say, it's considered like real sex is penetration. So I feel like, yeah, it came from a personal place of like wishing that I'd had access to more expansive and more gender equal and more pleasure centric information about sex myself, and I felt like there was very little of that available that was contextualized to the sort of Indian social and cultural landscape, also in Indian languages. And I figured that even if I don't have all the answers, I am going to at least ask the questions, and I will collaborate with other people who do, whether that's doctors or activists or whoever it is. And or even people with lived experience. I mean, I think lived experience is also a very valuable source of learning. We should hear more from the types of experiences that have been systemically marginalized or silenced, or until 2018 you couldn't legally be out in India. Exactly. It's crazy, right? So we need to hear people's voices that weren't even allowed to have that chance to explain or express how they experience the world. So I was really keen to just create a place where these conversations can happen. And then over the last 5 years, I've also made it my business to learn about this stuff. Where do there isn't really a college in India or some program you can go to become a sex educator. There are a few programs in other parts of the world, but it isn't an easy qualification to kind of like, oh yeah, just go to that place and you'll get the certificate. You know what I mean? And so I've really tried to create a curricula for myself based on various programs that do exist internationally, and read all those books. And even at this point, given the kind of following I have, very fortunately, I've been able to connect one-on-one with experts around the world, whether it's therapists or gynecologists or activists or whatever it is. And it's enriched my own understanding so much. Like just doing this work, I have learned so much, But I feel like it's a two-way learning. It's not like I'm just educating, I'm also learning. And I've always been very upfront about that. I've never tried to posit myself as as the person with all the answers or something like that. It's more like I just wanted to make it feel okay to talk about this stuff. And simply by feeling okay talking about this stuff, I feel people are more likely to be able to seek out the solutions that exist for whatever conundrums they face in this department. But if it's not even okay to talk about your conundrum, how do you seek a solution? Whether it's emotional, physical, health, or relationship-based or whatever else.
When you're talking about when you came back, and I think and about education, I was reminded of something that happened, I think, way back in school. Apart from what you would see in, let's say, movies, if you happen to watch something which your parents said you couldn't watch when you were younger, or you happen to, somebody would give you some pornography to watch or a magazine. I think one of the first times you actually learn about even the penetration part is in biology class, right? And I was reminded of something, and I remember I didn't know. So teacher said, okay, this is how penis kind of comes in. And the sperm goes inside the vagina, right? And I said, how? I had an honest question. And she said, after marriage, it will happen. Right. And this is a biology class, right? And I remember going back home, and thankfully dad's a doc, and he said, well, let me just draw this out for you. This is how this part works, but this is not the only part about sex, is what he said. And so I kind of went back and had this chat with a few friends. And I remember back then thinking about the fact that whatever I had kind of seen or heard of till then was only about, like you said, the penetration part. It's only about, okay, this is what sex is, and I'm gathering. I don't want to blame a gender, but I can gather that it was men who wrote that part of this is what sex is. If I want to generalize here, but I feel what also has happened because of that's you treat it that way. Sex is supposed to be part of health ed, which I think everybody had in most schools, but it was never really taught. It was like people would like giggle in the background or make a bad joke, and you kind of walk away from it. So it starts from there. It starts from school. And I remember punishment for guys in my school was if you make noise, sit between two girls. So you're not even told that you can be with the other gender as much. And so eventually, when you do get to college, when you can have these experiences, you're also like stuck with, okay, how do I even approach someone? How can I have this conversation? Forget intimacy. So then you want to kind of get to the sex part, because then it becomes like I think for most men, and I feel this is the big problem which I have seen, because I reflect back on my own youth, and I'm like, it was almost like something you had to kind of achieve, that you've had sex. And only when you get older do you realize it's not like a competition, right? It's not like it's not like, and you need to find someone you can actually be intimate with, and in that search for the accomplishing sex, as it was, you forget that the intimacy part is even there. And I feel men don't learn enough about intimacy. I feel women at some point, I feel because of being segregated in that education part of it entirely, I feel at some point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm coming from a totally like guy perspective here. I feel men don't even understand how intimacy works oftentimes. And I think and in many ways you can be shown a mirror saying this is what you need to do for the other person, whoever your partner is, gets lost somewhere in between. I know I've just kind of gone on a tangent here, but how do we teach intimacy more than anything else, right? I think it kind of has to stem from there, even before we get to pleasure and sex.
You've mentioned so many different things, so I want to touch upon a few of the things you've mentioned. One of the things you talked about was that there's this focus on penetration. The teacher was like, this will only happen after you get married, instead of providing you an explanation. So in society in general, there tends to be this hierarchy of sort of circumstances within which sex is acceptable. And a opposite sex, same religion, same caste marriage tends to be the only truly socially acceptable, like publicly acceptable context within which people can publicly admit to having had sex, right? You have children, for example, that is evidence of your sex. But there's this very like keen and acute focus on marriage, and ideally an endogamous marriage being the like umbrella under which it's okay to have sex. Yeah, but endogamous as in within your community. So marriage is essential, but if you're married to someone of another religion, or you're married to someone of a different caste, or married to someone who's from a different socioeconomic background than you, then it's a little bit less socially okay. If you're married, you can't even get married yet in India to someone of the same sex. So we have these preconditions even within that umbrella of marriage as to which types of marriages are okay and which are not, and therefore which preconditions for sex are, the most legitimate, so legitimate, quote unquote. And then anything else, including masturbation, shockingly, and this really like boggles my mind. Anything else is a little bit shameful. Premarital sex, extramarital sex, sex with somebody from a different community, sex with someone of the same sex, sex with multiple partners, paid sex, and masturbation, all not okay in comparison to sex within a marriage, right? Even though, I mean, for me, the masturbation one, like really, like, I mean, none of it is cool. All of it we need to unpack. But seriously, like masturbation is literally the safest way of experiencing sexual pleasure, minus the risks of infection or unwanted pregnancy. It involves literally no one other than you. What is the problem? But no, in society, we are told even that is very shameful and bad and not to do it, right? So it's this very funny thing that, I mean, I think is very, very deeply tied into the patriarchy, where sexuality, particularly women's sexuality, is surveilled and controlled and packaged for, reproducing existing social hierarchies. You must marry and have children and marry within your own social group so that we can replicate the social order that currently exists. And women are supposed to have babies, not orgasms, right? and only men and women can be having sex at all. Anyway, so it's this very odd paradigm that in many ways seems so like caveman-like, but in 2022, it is still how much of the world continues to operate. right? So that's one thing I feel, that then pleasure and intimacy and all isn't even part of the like construction of this framework. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
very like how should I say? It's a very transactional and like social order driven kind of framework within which people are expected to operate, and to a large extent people still do operate, you know, because it's so deeply entrenched we don't even question it. It's almost like we assume this to be the natural order of things, but this is not the natural order of things. And similarly, there's a very gendered conditioning around how sex must sort of, how sexual behaviors and how sex must be navigated. You know, firstly, it's very heteronormative, but within that heteronormative condition, men are posited as the sexual predators and women as the sexual gatekeepers. So men should always want sex. They should go, like, men are on the prowl, on, you know,
Yeah,
hunting for sex in a way. And women, you know, must not give it. It's this thing, partly because the stakes are a little bit higher in terms of the risks that come with sex. But unfortunately, pregnancy tends to be something that isn't seen as a shared responsibility when it's an accidental pregnancy. Too often, the burden of that falls entirely on women as well, and also the shame and the sort of like the stigma and the
yeah,
consequences of you know, premarital
exactly.
or any kind of sexual activity outside of that like marriage thing we talked about. The consequences tend to be more severe on women, right? And by doing all of that, you keep this framework alive, that the men are the predators, you are the gatekeepers, and in a way, sex becomes this transaction that women must only reluctantly participate in, and men must always, you know, like masculinity is constructed almost in relation to things like how big your penis is, how many women you've had. It's so damaging. And then femininity, on the other hand, is like constructed in accordance to stuff like virginity, purity, innocence, you know, and I feel like this whole framework is very damaging. And when you think about it, neither consent nor safety nor pleasure even features in these frameworks. You know, I mean, in India today, marital rape is not a crime.
Yeah,
And marriage
exactly.
remains a thing only heterosexual couples can participate in. And a very small fraction of marriages take place outside of caste and community, you know, like, how should I say?
Yeah, you
Intercaste
don't
or
go beyond those
interreligious
borders.
marriages remain a very small, yeah. So by and large, we still operate within these kind of templates. And so, I mean, where are we even taught about anything to do with like vulnerability or emotional intimacy or
Yeah,
gender equal pleasure, or like that just doesn't feature, you know, in the information we're getting in any kind of official context, you know. So yeah, I mean, sorry, I don't know if that was me going on a tangent after you went on a tangent, but I just wanted to set that kind of like
no, it's so true, right? And at the end of the day, and why I picked that one up is that I feel that what you're doing with all the content you create and everything that you share is that you're normalizing sex and intimacy. I think at the base level, all these things are shown as, oh, this is not normal. You don't need to know this. You should, if you know it, like whisper. Don't like put it out there. You could have do it under like close the door and talk about it. Whereas these are things we should all know. And we should in many ways know that way before we even have a partner. I mean, I sometimes think back about like how do people even learn about masturbation, right? How do people learn about, again, it's a whisper. Like someone in your class will say, have you done this yet? And then someone else will say, how do you do it? And that will kind of go into that context. It's still a whisper. It's never a, I mean, honestly, it's healthy to do it because in many ways, and I'm not going to comment on nofap. I have too many opinions on it. I just don't want to waste time on it. So I'm not going to get into that. I don't understand it. So I will choose to kind of let that one go. But I keep going back to, and I feel in many ways, personally as well, I went through that competition you spoke about, right? I went through that, oh, never really going to intimacy part. Finding a partner, but at some point really failing at understanding what intimacy could actually add to a relationship till I was much older. And in many ways, once you kind of find that lens is when you can actually truly have a partnership. I think we take away the value that intimacy kind of brings to a relationship or a marriage. It's not marriage adding to intimacy and sex. It's actually the, I think we turn that journey the other way around. Um, And as you're sharing this and you're kind of trying to normalize things, how do you find your own mindset kind of evolving? Like, because you have to kind of keep a lens of, I don't know if it's sticking to a line, because sex can very easily be, I don't think it's an Indian thing, it's a world thing, that this whole, like, sex can very easily become a topic that can be scandalous, and you can make it like something that gets the eyeballs. But what you're talking about is something that's so on point for someone to learn about how they should actually deal with their own bodies and with their partner's bodies. How do you stick to that line?
For me, I feel like my content, I seek to normalize such conversations and to educate about scientifically accurate, like factual information, right? I don't do that much opinion based content, even though I have opinions. But I feel like let's start with the facts, right? Because the opinions we can debate about, but facts are facts. And how do you even formulate an educated opinion on something if you don't know the facts? If you don't know what these parts of the body are, if you don't know what consent is, if you don't know what and how contraception is to be used, how then can we even debate the nitty gritties on an opinion basis about these topics if we just don't know? If like you don't know the grass is green, what opinions can you have about grass, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm giving you a silly analogy there, but to me, at one level, so much of what I put out is just what I feel ought to be general knowledge. I to this day, I get messages in my DMs from, like, let's say women in their mid 30s being like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that I don't menstruate and urinate from the same opening. I just learned that at 35 from your video talking about the anatomy of the vulva. Now imagine if you were 35 years old and didn't know how your ear or nose works. That would be unthinkable, right? And yet, so many of us don't really know our own anatomy when it comes to our sexual and reproductive parts, right? I mean, many even might not be able to label on a diagram what their scrotum or perineum or prostate is, but surely we are entitled to this fact-based, scientifically accurate information about our bodies, right? Surely. I mean, it should be a basic right. It should not even take a sex educator to tell you this. You should have already learned this somewhere along the way from your parents or school or something, right? Just like we learn about many other things that might be far less useful even. So I feel like on a very basic level, I try and provide factful information that is not polarizing, that is simply, allowing for people to make more informed choices in their own lives. Because people's opinions on the more subjective elements of sex, let's say, when it is, whether it is okay to have premarital sex, how many partners it's okay to have, whether you can, various different elements more around these subjective nuances, I feel, are dictated by people's religious beliefs and upbringing and various other factors, which I'm not here to judge or comment on. You do you, but here is some information that might, at the very least, allow for you to make more informed decisions, when it comes to your own or another person's safety and health. And I mean, of course, I would try to inculcate a sense of, why don't we stop judging each other, right? You do you in your life and don't judge other people. I want to get an abortion. I should be allowed to get an abortion. You think abortion is unethical? You don't get an abortion. No. Today, it's very unfortunate that certain people try and this is happening on such a large scale in the US right now.
Exactly.
And it's crazy to me that in 2022, such a law is being revoked, I mean, I think that we must not infringe on each other's rights ever, right? We should allow for people to make their own choices. Why must any third party intervene in this most personal aspect of your life? And yet, when there's so little information, so much misinformation, people don't even have the facts, but they have a lot of opinions, often very misguided opinions. I mean, when you think about even the types of things people believe about the hymen and virginity, the fact that women continue to be ostracized, shamed, beaten up, and even killed for not bleeding on their wedding night, when in fact, I mean, some people are born without a hymen. Many people don't bleed the first time they have sex. And anyway, it shouldn't matter whether someone has had sex or not. It is literally, like, the whole idea of virginity is such a constructed and ridiculous idea, right? And yet, People might not even know what the hymen is, or have never even understood what that tissue does, or whatever, but they will have this idea that there should be blood on the sheets, you know?
Yeah.
So or that a woman who's had sex before marriage is a slut, or whatever. I don't know. Bizarre things people will believe without even understanding any of the assumptions they've been led to make to get to this belief, you know?
Yeah.
Or the problems with those assumptions. So I try and scientifically accurate, judgment free. I try and ensure that my content is those two things.
Speaking of assumptions, and you said that, is that as you learned more, and you like you said, you didn't just kind of go out and start talking about it. You spend time learning, and you spoke to experts, spoke to gynecologists. If you had to pick up some of the most base level misconceptions we have around sex and intimacy, um, w- eh, both as men and as women, what would those be? I know I've given you a broad question to and asking you to simplify it, but
There's so many, right? I feel like to a large extent, because of that shame and guilt and fear that we're kind of taught from a young age to associate with anything to do with sex, a lot of us think a lot of bad things can happen to you if you even partake in like masturbation. Like I get so many questions, for example, especially from young men, being like, if I masturbate, will XYZ negative outcome happen? Whether it's acne, hair fall, muscle loss, memory loss, blindness, will hair grow on my palms? Will I go to hell? Will I ever be able to get a wife? Will my penis shrink? So many things that have absolutely no correlation with masturbation have somehow been conflated with it as if these are the inevitable negative outcomes if you do this,
yeah,
And the funny thing is that if you're like, let's say you're a 16-year-old teenager who's anyway facing acne, because it's very common symptom of puberty and
exactly.
oily skin and whatever it is. So today you have a pimple, coincidentally, but yesterday you masturbated, and now today you think, oh my gosh, this is like a punishment from God for masturbating, it's so unfortunate that happens, but that happens, right? People will falsely correlate to unrelated incidents because of the belief that they already have. If you believe something's going to cause something, if coincidentally that thing happens anyway, you're going to be like, that's why it happened. Or if you feel really bad about doing something, even if it makes you feel good to do it, you're probably going to feel guilty after, because in your head you've done this bad thing, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of the questions I get and the misconceptions that might exist stem from that fear, shame, and stigma-based kind of sort of base level from which any existing ideas around sex have stemmed. Whether it's, again, what I was talking earlier about the hymen and virginity, or this emphasis on women's virginity, whether it's the shame around masturbation. A lot of this has to do with the fact that somewhere you've been planted in your head at a very young age, this idea that these are bad, shameful things to do, and so people get worried when they do them, like, that something terrible will happen. I would say the umbrella question I get asked is like, am I normal? Am I normal? Is this body part normal? Are my fantasies normal? My curiosity is normal? And so, I would say, zooming out, like, people seem to require reassurance that they're perfectly normal. Bodies, desires, etc., are in fact normal, So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that goes to the root of it in many ways, right? And I think that also goes to the root of a lot of issues that happen in communication within a relationship. You have partners who would not communicate what works for them and doesn't work for them, and both are left. One is left with, okay, performance anxiety. Okay, I can kind of sense that the other person wasn't satisfied. The other person's left, how do I communicate without shaming that what you're doing isn't working for me? And therein lies, I think, one of the cruxes, right, of the whole thing is that how do you communicate without shaming, considering we have that all that shame from childhood. How do we still communicate with our partners about what works for us or what will work for them? And I think that's something which I feel most people struggle with till they come to a relationship where they can be as open as to talk about anything.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like getting comfortable with your own body, your own sexuality, and talking about it, let alone getting comfortable with your partner's body and sexuality, it's a journey. I would be lying if I said, like, it'll just happen tomorrow. But I think that the first step is to even be willing to embark on that journey, right? Most of us don't even stop to think about this stuff. Like, I think, so many times people ask me, like, why do you do this? Like, what is the need to, why do we need to talk about sex? Do you only think about sex? As if sex is some kind of activity that just happens once in a while in a dark room on Saturday night, without thinking about sexuality as this like rather fundamental element of your whole being. You know what I mean? Even if you've never had sex, or even if you're asexual, sexuality is still a part of what makes you you. It doesn't have to do with the actual act of having sex. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
How you identify, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, all these aspects of who you are on a very fundamental level actually shape how you see the world, how the world sees you, and are often a result of a combination of factors, whether it's biology, upbringing, cultural elements, your own learnings. It's like, and it's very hard to isolate any of these things. We don't operate in silos, it all operates together. And yet we are never encouraged to stop and think about this stuff. Like, who are you really? We're not encouraged to think about that at all. We're just told what to do from a very young age. You will do this and this and this, and then you will study this, and you will become this, and you will marry this person, and you will just be quiet and ask no questions and follow this template. Okay.
Yeah.
So the question of thinking about your gender or sexuality or sexual orientation or what you want from a relationship or what gives you pleasure, like, this is something that ends up having to be a very deliberate and personal, like, endeavor that you choose to make for yourself, because no one's handing it to you on a platter, unfortunately. You know what I mean? You're more like, people hand out a lot of other things to young people to learn on a platter. I think most of us can recite some Shakespeare and maybe there's some mantras and maybe do multiplication tables because we were made to, but no one ever tells us to think about this stuff, right? No one even asks you to think, like, who are you? Who do you want to be in this world? We're rarely asked to see ourselves in that more subjective, like, humanity oriented way. And so I really think, like, in order to communicate with your partner or anybody else, first you need to know about yourself enough to be able to effectively tell someone else, right? Yeah. So I feel like embarking on that journey of sexual self-discovery, and particularly for people with vulvas, because we are like systemically denied information about our own bodies, exactly, can be like radical. It can just be so like, oh my God, I didn't even know my body was capable of feeling this way. I didn't even know that I didn't know. So I feel like first getting to know yourself, like getting to know your body, your sexuality, and maybe not first, maybe everything can happen simultaneously as well, because it's never too late. Like, if you're already in a relationship or if you're already married with kids, doesn't mean you can't go back and learn about your own body if you haven't already. Do you know what I mean? So wherever you are in your journey, I feel like getting really well acquainted with yourself and then establishing that type of environment with your partner where both of you do feel like you can speak frankly without judgment and also without expectation. Let's say you're curious about something, maybe your partner doesn't want to do it. It would be nice if you could still express your curiosity without that other person feeling pressure that they have to do this thing now. And similarly, let's say something's not working or you don't like something, you should be able to say that without that other person feeling like you don't, like it's a personal attack, or like you feeling like you have to hold back because your partner's ego will be hurt. So if we could get better at like cultivating a radical honesty and but also a very compassionate and gentle and caring kind of atmosphere where we're in this together, rather than it being a kind of arena where either party fears or shames the other person, or where either party feels like their boundaries aren't respected, or they are pressurized into going through with something because they're in the relationship with this person already, or whatever it is. So I feel like we have to get better at respecting each other's boundaries, and also at communicating our needs. It's a twofold thing. It's not just one or the other.
One of the things that holds people back from communicating, even if they figure out, and I feel I want to dig into self-exploration a little bit as well. But even post self-exploration, at some points, it's about, okay, if I tell my partner or whoever I'm with what I'm into, and then they tell someone else, will it come to phrase it this way, bite me later, when people kind of know, if it's not the established norm, it's some, if it's something that is not what you've all been told this is what this is about. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with, I mean, it's almost a lack of trust in some ways, right? Because there is shame, but there's also lack of trust. So how do you deal with that aspect?
I mean, I think you're touching upon a few things, all of which I guess need consideration. When it comes to sort of fearing being shamed for your, particular set of desires or fantasies or curiosities or whatever it is, that's one aspect, right? People might feel hesitation towards expressing a certain kink or a certain fantasy or something because they think, oh my gosh, my partner will think I'm a freak for liking leather boots or liking, I don't know, whatever it is, right? So on the one hand, there's that fear of like the specifics of your arousal are weird, and so you can't be honest about them. But honestly, the truth is that everybody has unique specificities to how their arousal functions. Maybe some person really likes body hair. Maybe somebody else really likes leather and lace or whatever, certain fabrics. Maybe a third party finds fruit really erotic, or maybe you find a certain garment or a certain activity, seeing your partner dance or sing might be really erotic to you. Like on a very, on the more minor level, there might be certain sort of preferences or tastes that you have, and maybe to certain parties there might be certain sexual acts or certain sort of relationship structures or whatever it is that floats your boat, right? And there is no formula. How should I say? There isn't just one way to have sex or one right way to have a relationship. It really is subjective. It really is varied and diverse. And I mean, that's what makes human sexuality such a compelling and magical force. It's so diverse in the way that it is experienced by different people. And I feel like if we can, I mean, obviously, right, the one line that we don't ever want to cross for sure is consent. You never want to violate someone's consent ever, right? And I think that if we can establish that, then between two parties, if you can honestly communicate about your preferences or curiosities or whatever it is, doesn't mean you have to act on them, right? It doesn't mean you have to act on them. Of course, both parties should be equally willing in order for an act to actually become part of what you do together. However, I think that as adults, it's not that difficult to sort of allow for each other to at least have that space where you can be honest, right?
Yeah.
So honesty without expectation. I mean, that's what I was speaking about earlier as well. I think that if you're in a relationship with someone, or if you're having sex with someone, whether casual or long-term or whatever it is, like you are sharing a pretty private, personal, intimate moment together, exchange together. And I think is it really so much to ask to simply be able to treat each other with decency and respect and compassion? I think that we should be able to trust each other at least that much, and we should value each other's trust. If you're sleeping with someone, surely you can allow for them to feel safe with you, right? Allow for them to feel like you're not going to misuse or shame or harm the person based on the experience they've had with you, as long as everything is consensual, obviously, and as long as you both, you know what I mean? I feel like it's hard to talk about this stuff also in very general terms, because unfortunately sex can be both this site of, like, on the one hand, it's a site of joy and connection and beauty, and I mean, one of the most magical aspects of life. And on the other hand, it can be the site of violence and, quite horrific things happen in this realm as well, right? So it's very hard for me. I like to, often when we're talking about this stuff without a focus on violence, I'm focusing on the potential of sex to be this wonderful thing. But I can't ignore the fact that it can also be and has, been utilized by certain structures in society as this tool of oppression, control, and violence. So I feel like we need to recognize both those potentials. But if we're in a relationship with somebody and it is something that both parties value, and you like each other, you want this together, then surely we can cultivate an atmosphere where we're both able to share without fearing judgment, but also without feeling expectations. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the way you would with a friend. Why is that so hard to do with your own lover, right?
Yeah.
Just
Have
extending that basic respect and compassion to each other.
that is so true, right? It's almost creating that, like you said, like creating that safe space, and in many ways, sometimes maybe even just stating the fact that this is a safe space, and that can almost make the other person kind of feel that, okay, maybe I can kind of be open about what I really want, and to understand what you really want. And I want to actually ask you, through your journey, have you had people you turn to for advice, for mentorship, and what's the best piece of advice you've gotten as through this journey that you've been on?
You mean advice on a professional level, or you mean
Yeah, on a
advice to
professional
do
level.
with sex? I've been lucky to have several wonderful mentors. One of them is a gynecologist called Dr. Nozer Sherrier. He's also a fantastic advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and for women's rights in particular globally. And I also have been lucky to be a recipient of the Pleasure Project's Pleasure Fellowship. And the Pleasure Project is this wonderful organization that advocates for the inclusion of pleasure in sex education communications and public health communications globally. And so Anne and Arushi of the Pleasure Project, Dr. Nozer, I mean, there's several more people. Honestly, I've been so lucky to be on the receiving end of a lot of support and encouragement. But just to mention three people that I've learned and gained a lot from. And I think uh, with Dr. Nozer, a lot of what I've learned about abortion and abortion in India and the legalities, the medical procedures, the whole thing, I learned from him, because it's not something I knew all that much about personally until I interviewed him. We've talked about it so much because it's something I've created content around, and I do feel that that it's an important subject to be able to talk about, even though it's a difficult one, And I think I learned from Dr. Nozer that while lots of things are subjective, and while it's always, you want to play it safe, not say anything that can ruffle any feathers, not say anything that can get you in trouble, etc. And I have no interest in courting controversy, or I'm not trying to do any clickbait. But sometimes, when you just know when something is right, there is a right side to this. And if you, even if it means hearing from detractors, sometimes you have to take a stance. Not sometimes, ideally always, when there is a distinct moral side to a debate or whatever it is, and you know which side is right. I think there is some imperative to not just be a bystander and stay neutral and let oppression and harm take place in the name of objectivity, or like, it's not my problems, I'm not going to do anything about it, whether it's abortion, or whether it's gay rights, or whether there's certain aspects that are still up for debate, which are absurd to me. You cannot be violating someone's rights in the name of your belief system. You believe what you want to believe. Do not inflict that belief system on others such that they can no longer live with basic dignity in their own life, right? So I feel like it was wonderful to get that sense of like courage and conviction, and standing up for certain things is something that it is your responsibility to do. And now you're talking about this stuff, you have to take a stand on certain things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It can be scary for anyone to talk about stuff that is sort of where there's a culture of trying to silence dissent, or trying to punish anyone who questions certain things.
Yeah.
It can sometimes be scary to talk about stuff. So I do appreciate that. And then what other advice? I think also, when you're doing this work, And again, I guess it's not just sex ed. Any kind of content creator perhaps receives some amount of, especially if you're a woman, some amount of unsolicited attention that is, how should I say? It can just be exhausting, I guess. It can be exhausting, to get to receive dick pics, to receive like lewd messages, and their justification is that you're doing this work, you're asking for it, right? It's like you're talking about sex, so now why are you upset when I say? Yeah, exactly. You're never asking for it unless you ask for it, right? How hard is that to comprehend? Exactly. But from other people, like Anne and Arashi at the Pleasure Project, I mean, there's some amazing people doing advocating for sex ed globally, and this is especially on the internet, but even in real life. I mean, any people doing this work are often on the receive when you tell someone you're a sex educator, or when it's like the average Joe, especially men, will be like, oh, like I could use some sex education, or some kind of assumption that suddenly you're available.
I know. I can like I thought of like 5 to 10 people at the back of my head who would say something like that, who I've met through my life, at least in an instant. As soon as you said that statement, like I could hear some sex.
Yeah, and I mean, to some extent, you just say it's par for the course, whatever. It's just the internet, and I think in general, on the internet, and to some extent even in our real life, I think there's so much more we can do to be more respectful and more sort of, I think, to acknowledge each other's humanity a little bit. I think like somewhere we are quite callous and quite easily cruel to people we don't even know, or even people we do know. I mean, I think how hard is it to be just like just basic human decency? How hard is that? So I always like to remind people, be nice, be kind. It's not that hard. But yeah, I think that I've learned from other people doing this work that to some extent you do separate this is work. You're talking about this stuff. You want to raise awareness, but you don't owe people shit. Like I don't owe anybody anything. And so I am under no obligation to respond, acknowledge, or like, what I mean? I don't even look at my DMs anymore unless I've asked a specific question and I'm seeking insights from my audience. Like I don't think people sending me dick pics even are entitled to my time, to be honest, and that's okay. Like somewhere you are going to have to, you don't owe people emotional labor also. If there's a question that can easily be Googled, I'm not obligated to answer it. You know what I mean? Somewhere you need to like, I think, take not just in fact, I feel like it's not just the negative feedback that you might receive, whether it's slut shaming or trolling or whatever, even the I love yous and everything. I think you must, in general, social media is just one part of life. It's not everything. And I think when you're a content creator, it can feel a bit like this is everything. Like how many people like me or dislike me or something that really defines who I am. Yes. I don't think it defines who I am, to be honest. Neither the likes nor the slut shaming nor any of it. Do you know what I mean? There's more to me than this. And I'm not going to allow for other people to determine my sense of self-worth. I think like that's been an important message. And I think lots of content creators struggle with this. And I think, we should talk about that more,
So at a base level, what do you feel motivates you to do everything that you do? I mean, at the foundational level, what is your foundational motivation? I mean, if I can just put it simply like that.
My vision and mission statement is to imagine a world where all sexual experiences are consensual, safe, and pleasurable. And that really is what motivates me. I mean, I think that, as we were saying earlier, a positive sexual experience can be one of life's most profound joys, most profound. And I feel like women in particular are systemically denied this joy. It's like, this isn't even like you aren't supposed to go there. This is not for you, know? And I think that for me, it's been such a, like, joyful sexual experiences for me have been so fantastic. And even solo, it doesn't always have to be partnered. That some part of me just like wishes more people could experience that. I want women to have more orgasms. I'm telling you, on a very fun, or at least an orgasm. There's so many women in the world today that have never had an orgasm. I feel like, and you know, I know this might sound frivolous. The other sad thing is that many people think sex is kind of funny or frivolous. Even the joke I said earlier about how men might be like, "Oh, I could use sex education."
Yeah.
Like they think, oh, some woman talking about sex in their head is a slut, basically, and that it can't possibly be a serious matter. Sex education, haha. You know, but actually, when you think about what makes a society a developed society, when we look at indicators of development, okay, gender equality is one of the high indicators of development. A country where the gender equality index is considered very positive is usually a very developed country. And when you really think about it, what better indicator of gender equality than orgasm equality, or you know, sexual experiences where all people of all genders are reporting equally pleasurable experiences. Today, all over the world, straight women are the least likely to experience orgasm during a sexual encounter by miles when compared to straight men, gay men, bisexual people. Well, bisexual women and straight women, it's not that far, but anyway, etc., etc., etc. Basically, in heterosexual sex, women's pleasure is not a priority and hasn't been, and women are having far fewer orgasms than men, right? And what does that say? I mean, okay, finally, we're talking about women in the boardroom, you know, more women leaders in government, whatever, equal wages. But there was a time when women couldn't even vote, right?
Yeah.
So we're looking at today, women CEOs is a big thing, which is true. I mean, we need to make progress and equality in all these realms, but I think the bedroom is still something we don't talk about.
Yeah.
You know, it is in some ways the last bastion of the patriarchy in a way. And so I feel like if we did live in a world where women felt equally empowered to seek and express and experience pleasure, we would be living in a far more equal world, far more equal.
I mean, that's almost like a perfect way to kind of close the conversation. I have one question for you, which I should ask because the show is called that, is what do you do when you take a pause in life?
So I've moved to Goa. I grew up here, but I lived in Bombay for 10 years right after college. I moved here 6 months ago. And in many ways, the decision to move here is like that. I needed a pause. I mean, I'm still working like a crazy person, but at least I'm working in front of trees. And my little dog, I adopted a little dog, a little stray who's just like changed my life. And so, yeah, I think every time I within the day, take a pause, it is to spend time with my little dog. We run around or, you know, play with his little toys, and the most playful, sweet dog. He's still quite young, so he's very playful. But on a macro level, I feel like it's so important to take a pause, and my decision to move here and be close to nature and, you know, just change my lifestyle a little bit was very much about like making more time for things other than just work and work and more work. You know, commuting for work and meeting people only for work. I'm now closer to my family. I meet my parents live here, my brother lives here, my nanny lives here. I hadn't been close to my family physically, you know, in distance wise in so long. And I felt like I need to make time for what's important to me. Work is important, but it can be done with these other things. You know what I mean? Why must I make a choice? And so, yeah, but in smaller ways, I mean, I love to cook, I love to read, I love listening to music. So these are the few things that I try to do when I need a pause.
I think we just about scratched the surface of things we can talk about. But I want to leave some for hopefully another episode at some time down the line, which we should do. And I want to dig deeper into this as I get less and less awkward talking about it. And I feel I use podcasting as almost like a mechanism for me to be able to talk about things which I've always wanted to talk about and kind of talk to people about. So thank you for coming on the show, and I hope it was as interesting for you as it was for me, and I know it is going to be for the audience. And thanks for coming on Take a Pause.
Thanks for having me, Varun. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Leeza. And more than anything else, I hope it started you off or rather sparked some thoughts in terms of your own journey about sex, about intimacy, and so much more. Lots more coming your way on this show. Before you head out, I want to make sure you smash that bell icon and hit subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one.